Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you again in the world of these fascinating prehistoric stories. Today, we will travel back tens of thousands of years to witness one of the harshest battles for survival in human history. The struggle against the bone-chilling cold of the Ice Age winter, at a time when humans had no concept of down jackets or warm fabrics. This is not merely a story about endurance. It is an epic about the iron will of our ancestors, standing on the fragile boundary between life and death. So come with me as we immerse ourselves in the journey of a cave-dwelling tribe during one long, relentless winter night. The sky hung heavy and gray, like molten lead collapsing over the jagged limestone peaks. And when the final weak rays of daylight faded away, the true nightmare slowly crept into the valley. Boar, a young hunter with strong muscles yet trembling without control, stood at the entrance of the cave watching the first snowflakes of the season fall. They were not romantic as we might imagine, but sharp like tiny shards of glass cutting against bare skin. The flesh of Boar and the other members of the tribe had turned a pale, purplish color, their pores raised in a desperate attempt by the body to trap what little warmth remained. There were no wool sweaters, no insulating layers of fabric. The only protection they had were crude pieces of animal hide, stiff, foul-smelling, and barely capable of blocking. The howling wind that screamed through the cracks in the stone. The sound of teeth chattering echoed throughout the dark cave, forming a grim rhythm that blended with the wind howling outside. Fire, their only guardian, flickered. Weakly at the center as people huddled tightly together around it, they clung to one another, sharing the warmth of their breathing chests. The cold did not remain only on the surface of the skin. It seemed to crawl deep into the bone marrow, numbing the fingertips until they lost all sensation and turning bare feet into lifeless blocks of stone. Boar could feel the pain as if the blood inside his veins were slowly freezing, and every breath he exhaled became a cloud of white mist carrying away a fragment of life itself. In the dim darkness, the children cried from the cold until exhaustion pulled them into restless delirium, while the elders closed their eyes and whispered primitive prayers, hoping the sun spirit would awaken soon. To survive this night, they had to fight a terrifying psychological battle against the growing urge to sleep, a sweet trap laid by death itself. Because anyone who drifted into sleep in that moment might never wake again. They distracted their minds from the biting cold by telling stories, through growls and gestures, recalling warm summers and hunting journeys beneath golden sunlight. Whenever the fire showed signs of fading, fear erupted instantly. They were willing to sacrifice their most precious possessions, wooden spear handles or precious scraps of dried animal hide, just to keep the flames alive. The night felt endless. The cold seemed to freeze time itself, turning each passing moment into a century of painful endurance. Boar's lips cracked and bled, the blood freezing instantly into dark red scales, yet his eyes still burned with a fierce desire to live. It was the raw survival instinct that had allowed humanity to overcome nature's harshest trials and endure until today. And when the first light of dawn finally pierced through the frozen mist, the tribe looked at one another with hollow, exhausted faces. They knew they had won another battle, but ahead of them still lay a long, unforgiving winter waiting with unimaginable cruelty. When the first rays of the new day finally touched the entrance of the cave, they brought no warmth. Instead, they revealed a cruel reality. The last supply of dried meat had been completely exhausted, and hunger now gripped the stomachs of the entire tribe even more painfully than the cold itself. Boar looked around and saw the hollow eyes of his people fixed upon him. He knew that if no one stepped outside, the white death would come for them all before the sun set again. Tightening his grip on his wooden spear tipped with a sharp stone blade, his rough hands clung to the frozen shaft so cold that it felt as if his skin might stick to it. The first step outside the cave was a true shock. Snow piled up to the knees, crunching beneath his bare feet, and every step felt like his flesh was being sliced by razor-sharp ice crystals. The winter wind did not merely blow. It struck directly against the hunters' bare chests, making their lungs ache each time they inhaled the dense, freezing air. They moved in a single line, each person stepping into the footprints of the one ahead to conserve the last of their strength, their eyes scanning constantly through the drifting mist for any sign of life. A giant wild bison or even a small snow rabbit would have been enough to save an entire tribe. The cold began attacking Boar's will in a more cunning way. His mind grew foggy, and hallucinations of sunlit grasslands appeared before his eyes, taunting him. He had to bite his lips repeatedly, letting the taste of blood and the sharp pain drag him back to the brutal reality around him. Suddenly, behind a line of snow-covered pine trees, a large, dark shape appeared, a lone old reindeer digging through the frozen ground in search of moss beneath the thick ice. Boar's heart pounded wildly, not from fear but from hope. The blood inside him seemed to boil, pushing the cold away for a brief moment as his hunting instinct awakened. The chase unfolded in complete silence, broken only by heavy breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. The hunters communicated with skilled hand signals, surrounding the animal in a narrow mountain pass where the storm winds roared the loudest. When Boar's spear drove deep into the animal's shoulder, a surge of hot blood burst forth. In that moment, the prehistoric hunters rushed forward, not only to finish the kill, but also to press their frozen purple hands into the steaming blood, desperately absorbing its fleeting warmth. Nothing was wasted. The animal's hide, still warm, was stripped immediately and draped over their shoulders, while the fat was saved to rub onto their skin to protect against the dry wind. The journey back to the cave with their prize across their shoulders proved even more terrifying as a snowstorm rose and swallowed every path. Boar could barely feel his legs anymore. They moved only through a raw instinct to survive. When they finally stepped back into the cave, the faint warmth of the remaining fire welcomed them like a paradise on earth. Fresh meat roasted over glowing coals, its scent driving away the smell of death itself. For the first time in weeks, rare smiles appeared on faces covered in dirt and frost. That night they had not only food, but also new animal hides, thicker ones, to protect the children from the claws of winter. The battle with nature was far from over, and tomorrow might be even harsher. Yet our ancestors had proven something powerful. As long as the fire in the human heart continues to burn, and as long as people remain united with one another, no winter can ever extinguish humanity's hope. They lay down beside each other, resting their heads upon the rough reindeer hides, listening to the wind howling outside like the defeated song of nature itself, before the unbreakable will of humankind. As the snowstorm outside began to howl more violently, swallowing the entire landscape in a blinding white haze, Boar sat beside the flickering firelight, staring down at his rough hands as they carefully pulled apart the thin yet durable sinews from the leg of the reindeer they had just hunted. This moment marked a turning point in their survival, a quiet revolution born directly from the unbearable pain of the human body. They could not forever wrap themselves in fresh animal hides that were soaked and stiff, because once those hides dried beside the fire, they shrank like tightening clamps around the chest, making even breathing difficult. Boar picked up a small piece of hollow bone, sharpened at one end, and used a stone to carve a tiny hole through the other side, an early creation that future generations would one day recognize as the first sewing needle of humankind. Under the pale yellow light reflecting against the cave walls, the women of the tribe began a delicate task unlike anything they had done before. Using their teeth, they split the animal sinews into thin strands, chewing them repeatedly so they became softer and more flexible under the moisture of their saliva. Every stitch that pierced through the thick hides required extraordinary effort from fingers swollen with frostbite. Yet the hope of creating proper protection gave them strength. Piece by piece, they began stitching scraps of hide together, forming crude sleeves and the very first coverings for the feet, primitive boots that protected soles already hardened by the frozen ground. The feeling of soft fur finally resting closely against the skin, blocking the icy wind from slipping through gaps, felt almost like a miracle, like salvation from the frozen hell surrounding them. But their creativity did not stop there. They discovered that stuffing dry grass and bird feathers between two layers of hide created a pocket of trapped air that held warmth remarkably well, transforming these fur garments into mobile fortresses against the cold. Boar watched as the children of the tribe slowly regained the pink color in their cheeks. Soft laughter began to replace the groans of suffering that had filled the cave before. In that moment, a deep emotion rose inside him. They realized that no matter how cruel nature could be, it could never defeat the intelligence that emerged from hardship. These early garments were more than simple protection. They became symbols of pride, allowing hunters to endure longer in the open cold, to travel farther into unknown lands, in search of life without the constant fear that the cold would claim them in an instant. As the night slowly drifted toward dawn, the snow outside continued to fall steadily. But inside the cave, warmth was now preserved by thick curtains of animal hides, hanging across the entrance, blocking the violent wind. The tribe lay close together upon thick beds of fur, their breathing blending into the dense air of life within the cave. Boar leaned back against the stone wall, turning the small bone needle between his fingers. He knew that the battle against the Ice Age winter would continue for thousands of years. Yet humanity had discovered a key, the key that would unlock the door of evolution itself. From these simple stitches, a civilization would one day be woven. It began with suffering, but it would end with humanity, mastering the ever-changing forces of the natural world. When the first garments made from animal hides finally took shape, protecting bare chests from the biting claws of the cold wind, Boar began to realize something important. The cave, though strong and protective, could easily become a natural prison if they could not control the source of heat that kept them alive. Dry wood in the valley had become increasingly scarce beneath nearly 3 feet of snow. And every time the central fire began to fade, the entire tribe stood once again on the brink of extinction. One pitch-dark night, as tiny grains of ice slipped through the narrow opening of the cave entrance, a bold idea came to Boar's mind. They could not spend their lives endlessly searching for fire. They had to raise it, care for it, and carry it with them across the world. Boar began studying the firestones they had found before, smooth black rocks that produced tiny sparks when struck together. Those sparks were small and brief, yet within them lived the power of the sun itself. Soon the whole tribe began a new survival experiment. They did not rely only on the stones, they also searched for strange dry fungi growing on rotting tree trunks. These fungi were crushed into soft bundles that could catch even the faintest spark. The moment Boar's trembling hands finally coaxed a thin ribbon of smoke from the bundle, followed by a sudden bright flame, cheers exploded throughout the cave, louder than the roaring wind outside. They were no longer helpless creatures waiting for lightning to gift them fire. They had become the keepers of light, able to ignite warmth wherever they traveled, even in the heart of a raging snowstorm. This new power filled the tribe with courage. Soon they left the cramped cave behind and moved toward the wide plains where great herds of mammoths roamed during their migrations. There, in the vast open land without protective cliffs, our ancestors achieved one of the earliest architectural wonders in human history. They built homes using the bones and tusks of fallen mammoths. Massive thigh bones formed the foundation, while enormous curved tusks arched overhead to create the frame of a dome. Over this skeleton they stretched dozens of thick animal hides, sealing the structure tightly against the freezing winds. Inside these bone houses, fire burned constantly. Smoke escaped slowly through a small opening at the top, creating a warm and comfortable space where hunters could even remove their heavy fur garments and allow their skin to breathe after days of being trapped beneath layers of hide. Life gradually began to change. Instead of merely fleeing death, they began learning how to live within winter itself. Along the hide-covered walls of their shelters, Boar and the other hunters used black charcoal and red ochre to paint scenes of their extraordinary journeys. Images of fur-clad humans holding sharp spears, facing giant beasts beneath snowy skies. These paintings were not merely art. They were the first pages of history, recording the triumph of human will against the harshness of the universe. They no longer feared winter, because they now carried the sun within their fire bundles and carried their caves upon their strong shoulders wherever they traveled. On the final night of that long winter, as streams slowly began to thaw and the distant sound of birds returned to the valley, Boar stood upon a hill and gazed toward the far horizon. In that quiet moment he understood something profound. The bitter cold had never truly been a curse. It had been a forge, the harshest furnace that shaped human intelligence, courage, and unity. Humanity had stepped out of the darkness of fear and begun its transformation into conquerors of the natural world. And thousands of years later, their descendants would look back with gratitude at those first bone needles and those small, fragile fires that burned through the frozen nights of the Ice Age. Thousands of years have passed like the blink of an eye in the long timeline of history, and the bare footprints Boar left upon the white snow have long since been buried beneath countless layers of the Earth's crust and the passage of time. Yet what that tribe endured and created was never truly lost. It became fossilized into powerful evidence of humanity's unbreakable spirit. Deep within a cave in the Altai region, modern archaeologists once stood in stunned silence when they discovered a tiny, sharply pointed fragment of bone with a small hole pierced through it. The sewing needle of Bohr. It lay quietly among layers of ancient dust, but it carried the intellectual force of a revelation, proving that our ancestors defeated death not with strength alone, but with patience, ingenuity, and care for one another. As researchers continued turning over layers of earth and stone, they uncovered mammoth bones carefully arranged in deliberate patterns, forming a protective circle strong enough to withstand even the fiercest blizzard. Standing inside the cold cavern, scientists gazed upward at ancient wall paintings made from charcoal and red ochre, where Bohr had once drawn images of people standing hand in hand around a glowing fire. In that moment, they realized something profound. Although modern humans now live in towering skyscrapers with advanced heating systems, the blood flowing through our veins still carries the warmth of that prehistoric fire. Bohr's trembling before the freezing wind was the beginning of human creativity, and the pain of the icy cold became the catalyst that allowed humanity to weave the magnificent tapestry of civilization that would follow. The story of the Ice Age winter is not merely an old tale of survival. It is a reminder to all of us today about the power of connection. When we look at the warm clothing we wear, we should remember the swollen fingers of prehistoric women who chewed strands of animal sinew to sow hope into existence. When we switch on a heater, we should remember Bohr and his struggle to protect every tiny spark of fire in the darkness of the night. It was that bone-deep endurance that forged a species unwilling to surrender to fate, a species that learned how to turn darkness into light and transform deadly cold into the warmth of human compassion. At last, the sun of an Ice Age spring rose above the horizon, dissolving the frozen mist and warming the gray slopes of stone. Bohr's tribe stepped out from the cave, no longer trembling and bare, but standing like warriors dressed in fur armor, carrying with them the eternal flame of survival. They looked toward the distant horizon where new lands awaited them, ready for journeys even greater than those they had already endured, and so their footsteps continued across the earth, guiding humanity through the darkness of ancient ages toward the world we know today. The story of that struggle for survival would forever remain a timeless epic, echoing through the winds of wild landscapes and beating quietly within the heart of every human being. When the spring of that year truly arrived, the earth itself seemed to tremble as it awakened beneath the force of melting waters. The cracking of ice echoed across the valley like early thunder, announcing that a new era was beginning. Bohr stood upon a high outcrop of rock. The cloak made from reindeer fur that he had recently sewn was damp with the morning frost, yet it no longer made him shiver. He no longer looked upon the valley with the eyes of prey being hunted, but with the gaze of a master observing his own territory. Below him, the tribe was preparing for a great migration. They were no longer carrying only sharp stones and crude wooden tools. Now they carried with them an entire treasury of survival knowledge. There were leather pouches filled with dry fire tinder, portable frames made from mammoth bones that could be assembled into shelters wherever they traveled, and most importantly, the first fur-lined footwear stuffed with soft bird feathers, allowing them to walk farther than any other primate ever could. Each step they took now was steadier, stronger, and carried them farther across thawing marshlands and through forests beginning to bloom again. Yet the greatest gift left behind by that brutal winter was not the animal hides or the bone needles. It was the birth of language and empathy. During those endless winter nights when they had huddled close together for warmth, they had learned to use sounds to describe pain, to use their eyes to share hope, and to use their hands to promise a tomorrow. They discovered that no matter how strong a single individual might be, one person alone would fall to the cold. But a tribe that shared warmth and protected one another could become something close to immortal. The story of Bohr and those prehistoric people did not end inside that cold cave. Instead, it became the beginning of humanity's long journey to conquer every corner of the earth, from the frozen tundras of the north to the blazing deserts of the south. Wherever humans traveled, they carried with them the lesson learned from that winter. The lesson of turning fear into strength and turning hardship into invention. Millions of years later, when you stand in a modern winter, feeling the warmth of your coat or watching the flames dancing in a fireplace, take a moment to listen to the wind outside your window. Within that wind, you might still hear the whispers of our ancestors, those who stood firm during the Ice Age, who stitched the first needles with numb hands so that we might live in a warmer world today. The battle against the cold may be over, but the fire they ignited will continue to burn forever, lighting the path of humanity's endless evolution. When the bone-chilling cold of the Ice Age finally began to retreat, summer arrived in the valley not as a gentle dream, but as a powerful and restless force. Melting snow turned the quiet streams into raging torrents, roaring through the land and sweeping away everything in their path. For Boar and his tribe, the changing world brought warmth, but it also created new survival challenges just as harsh as winter itself. The blazing sunlight was no longer a distant savior. It became a new test of endurance. Scorching skin that had long been accustomed to the darkness of caves and the heavy layers of animal fur. The first challenge of summer was clothing and cleanliness. The fur garments that had once saved them during winter nights now became dangerous traps of heat, causing their bodies to lose water quickly. Boar watched even the strongest men collapse from exhaustion beneath the burning sun. Slowly they learned to strip away the thick layers of fur, leaving only thin pieces of hide tied around their waists. For the first time in their lives, they felt the strange freedom of bare skin touching the open wind. But with that freedom came a new enemy: insects. Summer brought dense swarms of mosquitoes and forest flies that attacked their exposed bodies, leaving swollen bites and maddening itching. The tribe soon discovered a solution. They crushed forest leaves and mixed them with wet clay, spreading the mixture over their skin to form a dry mud armor that helped repel insects and cool their bodies under the fierce sunlight. Food sources also changed dramatically. The mammoth herds had migrated far to the north in search of colder air, leaving the valley to faster animals such as deer, wild boars, and flocks of birds. Hunting during summer demanded completely different strategies. They could no longer rely on animals slowed by deep snow. Instead, hunters had to build stamina to run for hours beneath the scorching sun. Boar soon realized that summer offered gifts beyond meat. Nature provided new treasures: berries, roots, and wild honey dripping from hidden hives. Women and children became the tribe's first plant experts, learning which mushrooms were safe to eat and which fruits held precious water to restore the body. Yet the greatest challenge of summer was preserving food. During winter, the entire world had been a natural freezer. In summer, fresh meat could spoil within hours. Boar and the hunters learned to smoke meat over open fires or dry it beneath the harsh sun to store for later days. Life was no longer confined to the damp cave. The tribe began building temporary shelters, made from branches and large leaves beside flowing rivers. This was a season of movement, of long journeys exploring new lands, where they discovered stones more valuable than gold, sharp flint deposits that could be shaped into powerful tools and weapons. Summer also became the season of celebration and spiritual connection. Beneath star-filled night skies and the cool breeze of the open plains, the tribe gathered together not to escape death as they had in winter, but to celebrate life. They danced around the fire, the rhythm of wooden drums echoing through the forests, telling stories of the battles they had survived during the frozen months and praying for abundant seasons ahead. Boar stood in a field of grass that reached his chest, breathing in the scent of damp soil and wildflowers. In that quiet moment, he understood something important. Summer was the time to gather strength, to prepare both body and spirit for the relentless cycle of time. Winter had taught them how to survive, but summer was when humanity began learning how to truly live and to grow. When the summer sun gilded the towering grasslands that stretched higher than a man's head, the tribe's search for water led Boar and his people to a lush green valley where a great river curved across the land like a giant serpent. Yet the richness of this place also marked the beginning of a new and difficult chapter in their struggle to survive. The first confrontation between prehistoric human communities. Standing atop a windy ridge, Boar froze when he noticed strange columns of smoke rising from the lower banks of the river. It was not the fire of his tribe. Another group of people had already settled there, wearing animal hides decorated with eagle feathers and necklaces made from the fangs of large predators. They had claimed the most precious resource of the valley, the water itself. For the first time, Boar and his tribe faced a threat that did not come from wild beasts or the fury of nature, but from beings exactly like themselves. Tension filled the heavy summer air. The two groups stood across a dry sandbar facing one another, stone-tipped spears raised high, deep growls and warning cries replacing any form of greeting. In the prehistoric world, territory meant life. Losing the river meant the tribe would slowly die of thirst beneath the burning sun. But Boar, whose mind had been sharpened by the brutal lessons of winter, realized that a violent battle would leave both sides weakened and vulnerable. Instead of rushing into bloodshed, Boar did something no one expected. He slowly placed his spear on the ground and raised both empty hands into the air as he stepped forward. In one hand he carried a piece of wild honeycomb, golden and glistening in the sunlight, a treasure of the summer forest. The unexpected gesture caused the other tribe to pause. Their leader, an older man whose chest was marked with deep scars, stepped forward cautiously. After a long moment of silent tension, the leader accepted the honeycomb, tasted its sweet richness, and responded by offering Boar a large fish freshly caught from the river. That simple exchange changed everything. Instead of destroying each other, the two tribes began sharing the secrets that had kept them alive. Boar's people showed them how to sew warm clothing using bone, needles in preparation for the coming winter. In return, the river tribe taught Boar's hunters how to weave fishing nets from tree fibers, tools that allowed them to gather food from the river without exhausting themselves in endless hunts. Summer, once a season of territorial conflict, slowly became a season of cultural exchange and shared survival. Under the light of the full moon, early marriage ceremonies took place between members of the two tribes. The beat of animal skin drums echoed through the valley as strangers became one united community. Yet summer also carried storms born from the sky itself. Violent tempests swept suddenly across the valley, lightning tearing through the night and thunder roaring like the anger of unseen gods. Rain fell in torrents, turning the valley floor into thick mud and causing the river to rise dangerously fast. Boar and his new allies worked together, hauling heavy stones to reinforce the riverbank and pulling frightened children away from the rushing water. In those desperate moments beneath the white curtain of rain, the bond between the tribes grew stronger than ever. They realized that whether facing the beauty of summer or the cruelty of winter, humanity's greatest strength was not sharp weapons, but the ability to understand one another and stand together against hardship. As the final wildflowers of summer began to wither, and the first dry winds of autumn whispered across the valley, Boar looked out over the land that now belonged to a united tribe. They were no longer small groups hiding in caves, trembling before the forces of nature. They had become something greater, a living alliance of knowledge, gathered from forests, rivers, storms, and ice. Summer had taught them a powerful truth. Diversity and cooperation were the keys that would allow humanity to spread farther across the world. Under a deep red sunset, Boar smiled as he watched the children of the once separate tribes running and laughing together along the riverbank. They were the seeds of a future far beyond anything Boar could imagine, a future where humans would not only survive the wild world, but one day rise high enough to conquer the farthest horizons of the earth. As the forest leaves slowly shifted from deep green to burning shades of gold and crimson, an uneasy feeling began to settle in Boar's mind. Autumn did not arrive with the loud drama of summer thunder. Instead, it crept quietly into the valley through the dry, chilly winds of early mornings, carrying with it the scent of fading life and a cold warning that the brutal winter would soon return. For Boar's newly united tribe, autumn became a desperate race against time, a season of preparation that would decide who would live long enough to see the sunlight of the next spring. Under the leadership of Boar and the old chief, the valley transformed into a great bustling workshop. This was the season when knowledge was shared more intensely than ever before. Hunting was no longer random or opportunistic. Instead, the tribe organized large coordinated hunts to capture animals that had grown fat after a summer of rich grass. Meat was sliced into thin strips and hung across tall wooden racks so that the dry autumn wind and pale sunlight could preserve it. Some of the meat was smoked slowly above underground fires, ensuring it would last through the long winter. Animal fat was collected carefully and stored inside leather pouches, because they knew that during winter hunger, even a single spoonful of fat could mean the difference between life and death. But autumn was also the time when prehistoric humans began looking toward the sky and wondering about the mysteries above them. As they watched migrating birds flying south and noticed the stars slowly shifting across the deep black heavens, Boar felt a profound spiritual connection with the natural world. The tribe began performing their earliest rituals. Using red ochre, they painted concentric circles on cave walls to represent the sun. They danced around fires, praying that the sacred flames would never die. The first objects considered sacred appeared during this time: a carved tiger fang, a strangely shaped stone, items that had no practical purpose, yet carried immense spiritual meaning. These symbols gave the tribe courage. When facing the vast and mysterious universe around them, autumn also became the season when knowledge of healing and medicine began to grow. Elder women wandered through the forest collecting hard seeds, dry roots, and bitter tree bark, natural medicines that could reduce fever or stop bleeding during the harsh months ahead. They taught the children how to distinguish poisonous berries from safe ones, and how to use dried moss to cover wounds. These preparations were not only about storing food or materials, they were about building a shared system of knowledge that could protect the tribe from disease during the long months they would spend confined inside dark caves. When the final autumn rains turned cold and the first snowflakes began to fall lightly upon the distant mountains, Boar stood and looked across the valley. The storage racks were full. The mammoth bone houses had been reinforced with clay and fresh animal hides. For the first time, Boar did not feel the same paralyzing fear he had felt the previous year. Now he stood beside a tribe that was larger, organized, bound by belief, and strengthened by trusted allies. Autumn had taught them patience and foresight. It had transformed fragile creatures of the wilderness into careful planners of the future. That evening, the tribe gathered around one last great fire beneath the open sky. Yellow leaves drifted slowly to the ground while the flames flickered in the cool air. Soon they would retreat into the caves to face the long winter again. But this time they entered the darkness with pride in their hearts, knowing a simple truth. They were ready for winter, because they had become a people who would never again be defeated by time. As the first snowflakes of the new winter began to drift quietly through the air, the great cycle of the 4 seasons had completed another turn. Yet while one cycle closed, a greater chapter in human existence was just beginning. Boar sat once again inside the cave, but this time he was no longer alone. The flickering firelight danced across the stone walls, which were no longer cold and empty. They were now filled with drawings, symbols, and the warm presence of life growing stronger each day. The struggle for survival among prehistoric humans had begun to transform, from merely enduring nature to gradually mastering it. Within the darkness of the cave, a simple but powerful social order began to emerge. The elders were no longer seen as burdens. Instead, they became living libraries of knowledge, teaching the younger generation how to read the direction of the wind and how to sense the quiet warnings of the earth before a storm arrived. Children were no longer just running and playing. They began learning how to sharpen stones, how to tie strong knots, and how to remember the songs that told the story of their tribe. Labor within the tribe became more organized. Those with sharp eyes stood guard at the cave entrance. Those with steady hands repaired clothing and tools. The bravest hunters protected the land and searched for food. They were no longer living only for the present day. They had begun thinking about the many moons still to come. Survival also began to awaken the human spirit. For the first time, they learned how to create beauty. Necklaces made from shells and bright feathers woven into hair were not only decorations, they became symbols of pride, identity, and belonging. When a member of the tribe died, they no longer simply left the body behind. Instead, they placed flat stones over the resting place and sometimes laid a few dried flowers beside it. These quiet rituals revealed something profound. Humans had begun to understand the idea of the self, memory, and eternity. Survival was no longer just about keeping the heart beating. It had become about protecting the flame of culture and meaning. Each winter night, when the wind howled outside the cave like a distant threat from the darkness, Boar's tribe no longer trembled in fear. Instead, they gathered calmly around the fire. They shared pieces of dry smoked meat and told stories about the long journey they had survived together. They remembered the time when they were naked and shivering in the frozen wilderness. They remembered learning to hunt beneath the burning sun of summer, preparing wisely during the golden days of autumn, and finally returning to the cave as masters of their own fate. Through it all, they had discovered a powerful truth. Nature could be harsh and unforgiving, but the intelligence and unity of humans had no limits. Beyond the snowy mountains, the dawn of a new age was slowly rising. The footprints of Boar and his people would continue spreading across the land, crossing frozen plains, passing over ancient seas, and reaching distant continents yet unknown. They were the seeds of all future generations. With sweat, blood, and an unbreakable will, they wrote the first chapter of humanity's great epic. Their story will always remain a source of inspiration, reminding us of one timeless truth, even in the coldest and darkest moments of existence. As long as humans keep faith and continue working with their own hands, they will always find a path leading back toward the light. When stability in food and clothing finally freed the tribe from the constant fear of death, a new need quietly emerged from that growing abundance: the need to exchange. This was the moment when the earliest form of a market in human history was born. It did not exist inside grand buildings or busy cities, but beside large stones along riverbanks or at the crossroads of ancient migration paths. Bor soon realized that although his tribe was skilled at hunting and possessed many valuable animal hides, they lacked certain resources that other tribes controlled. The northern tribes owned sharp, high-quality flintstones ideal for weapons, while tribes near the coast carried beautiful dyes made from seashells. Instead of fighting for these goods, the leaders of different tribes began agreeing to meet on neutral ground. In these places, an unwritten rule emerged. All weapons must be left outside the circle of stones. Only open hands and fairness were allowed inside. The scenes at these prehistoric markets were vibrant and chaotic, filled with rough sounds and wild colors. There was no money yet. The value of every item was measured through effort and rarity. A magnificent tiger hide might be traded for a pouch full of finely crafted flint arrowheads. A small bag of pure sea salt, an incredible treasure that could preserve meat and improve flavor, could sometimes be worth as much as the massive tusk of a mammoth. But trade was never only about objects. These gatherings quickly became enormous markets of information. Bor stood among the crowds and watched how people used complex hand gestures and expressive sounds to explain where their goods came from. Traders told stories of distant lands rich with water, described strange animals wandering unknown plains, and shared remedies for illness, like bitter roots that could cure a stubborn cough. New skills spread from tribe to tribe through these encounters. People learned how to weave baskets from reeds, and how to shape early pottery from clay hardened by fire. Within these markets, human creativity began rising to new heights. To make their goods more attractive, women started decorating animal hides with delicate patterns and polishing bone rings until they shone. This early competition encouraged innovation and improved craftsmanship. Jewelry, such as colored stone bracelets or necklaces, made from sharp animal teeth, slowly became special items of recognized value, quietly laying the foundation for the future concept of money. When the sun finally sank behind distant mountains, the market gatherings would come to an end. Each tribe returned to its homeland, but none of them were the same as before. Inside their leather pouches were new tools and materials, and inside their minds were new ideas. Trade had broken the barriers of isolation. Small, scattered groups of humans were gradually transforming into a vast connected network. Bor understood something profound. The true strength of humanity did not lie only in the spear used to hunt prey. It also lived in the ability to connect with others and share value with fellow human beings. From those simple gatherings beside rivers and stone circles, the foundations of the global economy had quietly begun to take shape, planting the seeds for the prosperity and extraordinary progress that humanity would one day achieve. Amid the lively atmosphere of the riverside market, a single event suddenly captured the attention of everyone in the tribe: the arrival of a lone traveler from the high mountains to the west. He carried strange objects that Bor had never seen before in his life. The man had sun-darkened skin and sharp, watchful eyes. He sat quietly before a large leopard skin spread on the ground, and upon it rested a shimmering blue-green stone that glowed like the ocean under a full moon. It was pure copper, a rare and mysterious gift from the earth itself. Bor stepped closer, feeling a powerful curiosity rising within him. With the instincts of a leader, he immediately understood that if his tribe could obtain this hard stone, they would no longer need to rely solely on fragile flint arrowheads that easily shattered. But this exchange would not be simple. The traveler did not want dried meat, nor did he show interest in ordinary animal hides. Instead, he pointed directly at Bor's necklace made from the fangs of a saber-toothed tiger, a symbol of Bor's courage and status. This was no ordinary trade. It was a true contest of minds, where spiritual value was weighed against technological progress. Bor did not rush. He understood the rule of bargaining. Whoever revealed impatience first would lose. Slowly, he took out a small pouch filled with pure white salt, the white gold his tribe had carefully collected from exposed salt deposits after summer rains. Salt was a treasure for mountain people, essential for preserving food and maintaining health. Seeing the traveler's eyes shift slightly with interest, Bor added another item to the offer: a delicate bone needle, carefully sharpened and polished, along with a coil of softened animal sinew for sewing, one of the most advanced crafting techniques his tribe possessed. The two men spoke no words. Their communication flowed through narrowed eyes, subtle gestures, and intense glances. The traveler pushed the piece of copper slightly toward Boar, but then pointed to Boar's flint-tipped spear as well. Boar shook his head. Instead, he produced something else, a glowing piece of golden amber. Trapped inside it was a tiny insect preserved from ages long past, a mysterious object that many believed held spiritual power. The traveler's eyes immediately lit up when he saw it. At last, the exchange was completed. The copper was traded for the salt, the bone needle, and the sacred amber. This moment did far more than simply bring a new material into Boar's tribe. It marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in human development, the age of metal. Boar held the copper in his hands, feeling its cool weight and strange strength. He knew that from this moment forward, spears could be sharper, axes could be stronger, and his tribe's position among the surrounding peoples would rise. As the silver moon began to climb into the sky, the market slowly faded away. Boar returned to the cave, surrounded by the quiet respect of his people. He had brought back more than a valuable resource. He had brought back the promise of innovation and the pride of a tribe that understood how to use intelligence rather than force to shape its destiny. The survival story of prehistoric humans, from shivering winter nights to intense negotiations in primitive markets, remains one of the greatest testaments to human adaptability and ambition. They learned how to turn lifeless stones into tools, how to transform fear into courage, and how to turn strangers into allies. Their story still lives within us today, hidden deep inside every cell of our bodies, reminding us that the journey of humanity has always been a flowing river of creativity, resilience, and an unbreakable belief in tomorrow. As night fell, the valley was no longer a terrifying abyss of silence. Now the crackling of burning wood and the rich smell of roasted meat inside the mammoth bone houses created a space completely different from the cold wilderness outside. It was during these quiet nights that another world began to take shape, the world of language and the very first myths. Boar sat beside the central fire. Around him, children gathered with wide, curious eyes full of admiration. If the daytime belonged to the struggle of muscles and tools, the night belonged to the journey of imagination. To help his people remember the lessons of survival, Boar began weaving them into stories that thousands of years later would be called legends. Using his hands, he cast moving shadows upon the cave walls, shaping them into the figures of giant bears or the mighty spirit of the sun. "Do you know why the sun disappears each night?" Boar asked in a deep voice, tapping two stones together in rhythm. "It is because the fire spirit must rest and gather strength to battle the snow demon the next morning. If we allow our fire to die here in the cave, the fire spirit will grow sad and may never return." These stories were far more than simple entertainment. They were the earliest form of education. Through the tale of the snow demon, Boar warned the children about the danger of wandering during a winter storm. Through the wind spirit, he taught them how to listen to the rustling of leaves to sense when a storm was approaching. Their language was still primitive, half simple words, half animal-like sounds, but it carried a powerful ability to connect minds together, transforming separate individuals into a tribe that shared memory and understanding. Alongside storytelling, the tribe also discovered music. They created the first instruments, small flutes carved from the hollow bones of eagle wings pierced with tiny holes. The clear, high notes floated through the cave passages, blending with the deep rhythm of voices singing together. In those moments, survival was no longer just about filling an empty stomach. It was about warming the human spirit. Under the dancing firelight, the paintings on the cave walls seemed almost alive. They told stories of the great migrations, the bustling riverside markets, and the mysterious blue copper stone that had changed the tribe's future. The people slowly realized something remarkable. Humans may die, but their stories could live forever if someone continued to tell them. The life of prehistoric people, woven together with brutal reality and glowing myth, created an unbreakable spiritual strength. They began giving names to mountains and rivers, turning silent nature into companions and gods. Through language, they could pass knowledge from one generation to the next without each person having to suffer and learn everything from the beginning. And so, on this quiet night in a valley shaped by the Ice Age, Boar's voice continued to echo through the cave. Without knowing it, he was laying the first stones of humanity's great tradition of storytelling, proof that as long as people continue to tell stories, hope and the future will always remain alive. Before the next winter could fully cover the valley in white, Boar's tribe faced a decision that would shape their destiny. They could not remain here forever. The land had begun to give fewer resources, and the signs in nature suggested that a terrible shift in climate was approaching. Yet before leaving, Boar wanted to leave behind something meaningful, a mark, a message for those who might come after them, or perhaps for the spirits of their ancestors resting within the earth. From this desire came what would become the final paintings, a visual testament, written in color and stone, under the glow of torches made from fragrant beeswax. Boar and the most skilled members of the tribe moved deep into the darkest, quietest chambers of the cave. They did not carve the rock with sharp stones this time. Instead, they used the knowledge they had gathered through the seasons. They mixed animal fat with red ochre powder, black charcoal, and juices from wild berries to create paint strong, enough to survive the passing of time. Slowly, images began to appear on the rough stone walls. These were no longer simple, careless drawings. They formed a vivid map of survival. Boar painted hunters wearing fur garments, surrounding a massive mammoth, symbolizing endurance and courage. He painted the riverside market, with hands reaching out to trade, symbolizing peace and cooperation. And at the center of the great mural, he painted a blazing fire whose bright rays stretched outward, surrounded by small circles representing each member of the tribe. As he worked, Boar whispered words he had learned from the old chief, words that carried the spirit of a prayer. Stone may erode and rivers may dry, but our blood will flow forever, like the waters melting from the mountains. Whoever sees these images will know this truth. Here humans once lived, suffered, and struggled, but they never surrendered. At this moment, the life of survival had reached a new level of awareness. They were no longer living only to fill their stomachs. They were living for legacy. These final paintings were a declaration that humans were not mindless creatures defeated by nature. They were artists and thinkers, beings capable of transforming fear into art. On the day the tribe finally departed, snow had already begun falling heavily. They carried with them the blue copper stone, the bone needles, and small pouches of seeds for the future. But inside the cave, they left behind something far greater, an immortal spirit. When Boar stepped out of the cave entrance, he did not look back. He understood that the true fire was no longer the small flame burning on the pile of wood behind him. The real fire now burned within the minds of every person in the tribe. Together they walked toward the distant horizon, crossing lands that had never been named. They carried language, belief, and stories with them. The journey of prehistoric survival had now entered a new chapter, the age of wandering people who would spread across the world. And tens of thousands of years later, when we enter those ancient caves and shine our flashlights upon the red-painted walls, our hearts begin to beat faster. Because deep down we know those images are messages left by our ancestors, the very beginning of everything humanity has become today. As Boar's people gradually disappeared into the veil of frozen mist, the old valley sank into a vast and heavy silence. Yet while that land returned to stillness, life for the tribe burst into motion across the new territories they entered. Their journey was no longer only about searching for food. It had become a conquest of the limits of the human body and the awakening of human intelligence. Across steep mountain slopes where the air grew thin and the cold was even harsher than the ancient Ice Age valley they had left behind, the tribe finally began to use the blue stone, the red copper that Boar had traded for in the distant riverside market. They no longer spent endless hours grinding brittle rocks into spear points. Instead, they improved their fires, building hotter flames that could soften the strange metal. With careful strikes of stone hammers, they shaped thinner yet far stronger spearheads. These new weapons changed everything. Hunters could now strike large animals from farther away, reducing the danger that once cost many lives. Survival was no longer guided only by muscle and courage. It had entered a new era where tools and early technology began shaping destiny. But another discovery, quieter yet even more powerful, happened during the nights when the tribe rested along the long migration. From the leather pouches that carried their food, a few scattered grains fell onto the soil. After rain passed and days warmed, tiny green shoots appeared where the grains had landed. At first, the tribe paid little attention. Yet the women noticed something remarkable. Those plants grew from the very seeds they carried. a simple realization slowly emerged. Perhaps humans did not always need to chase animals across endless lands. Perhaps the earth itself could be persuaded to provide. From that moment, they began keeping the strongest seeds from autumn harvests. When the first rains of early summer arrived, they carefully pressed those seeds into soft soil and waited. It was a small act, almost insignificant at the time, but it planted the earliest idea of agriculture. The eternal wanderers of the wilderness had begun to learn patience. They had begun to believe that the land could be nurtured and that the future could be grown with their own hands. Their lives now balanced between wild survival and the faint outline of a coming civilization. As they crossed rivers and climbed mountains, they developed beliefs about the spirit within all things. To them, every valley had a memory, every stream carried a voice, and every tree stood as a silent guardian of the land. Whenever the tribe survived a dangerous crossing or reached the peak of a difficult mountain, Boer led them in simple rituals of gratitude. They placed colored stones in small circles on the ground, leaving quiet markers of their passing. Their language had also grown richer. It was no longer only a collection of growls and signals. Now they had words for things that did not yet exist, words for tomorrow, for dream and for family. Many seasons passed before the long migration finally slowed. On the final night of their journey, under a sky filled with countless stars, the tribe camped beside a wide, fertile plain, where dark soil stretched as far as the eye could see. Rivers curved gently across the land, and the wind carried the scent of grass in distant forests. Boer stood quietly and looked upward. In the flowing pattern of stars above him, he felt as though he could see the reflection of his people's long struggle across time. They had endured the white death of endless winters, the burning hunger of summer droughts, and the tensions of meeting rival tribes along the way. Yet here they were, standing together at the beginning of something new, a place where their children might not have to wander forever, a place where the fire of the tribe could burn for generations. Boer closed his eyes and smiled. Final words for the 4-hour epic. My friend, the journey we have followed is not only the story of Boer, it is the story of all of us. Every piece of clothing you wear, every meal you eat, and every word you speak carries the distant breath of those brave prehistoric people. They endured freezing winters so that warmth could one day become ordinary. They negotiated beside primitive stone markets so that trade and prosperity could grow. And they painted their dreams upon cave walls so that art and imagination could one day fill the human world. When this video comes to an end, take a moment to look outside your window and feel the flow of life around you. We are the descendants of a tribe that never gave up. The fire that Boer protected tens of thousands of years ago is still burning today and quietly, powerfully inside your own heart. It urges you to endure every winter of your life and keep walking toward the light. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. Now it is your turn to continue the story. Boldly, bravely, and brilliantly, just like those ancient humans once did. As the darkness of the old era slowly faded into the past, Boer's tribe no longer focused only on the ground beneath their feet. Their gaze began to rise toward the tallest mountains, where thick clouds gathered, and where legends about powerful gods were whispered among the people. Survival was no longer merely a struggle for food and warmth. It had become a challenge against the limits of the human body itself. As the tribe decided to climb into the cold highlands in search of precious stones and hidden metal ores buried deep within the mountains. To survive in those harsh lands, they had to learn entirely new skills. The air was thin, making every breath heavy and slow. They wrapped themselves in thicker layers of animal fat and fur to keep the biting winds from freezing their bones. To move across steep cliffs, they crafted strong ropes, braided from mammoth hide, ropes sturdy enough to hold the weight of a grown hunter. Each step upward meant facing violent winds that could sweep a person off the mountainside into a silent abyss below. Yet their desire to expand their world and discover new resources pushed them forward. To the tribes who remained in the plains, Boer's people began to look like giants, fearless explorers walking where no one had gone before. High among those towering peaks, they made another remarkable discovery. Certain crystals and polished stones could catch sunlight and reflect it across vast distances. By placing these stones in strategic locations, they created flashes of light that could be seen miles away. Without realizing it, they had invented one of the earliest forms of long-distance communication between distant settlements. But their progress did not stop there. Gradually, the tribe began to understand that true power was not only about taming animals. It was also about mastering time itself. During long nights beneath the open sky, Bohr carefully studied the cycles of the moon and the patterns of the stars. Year after year, he carved symbols into rock walls marking each full moon. Over time, these markings allowed the tribe to predict when floods would arrive and when migrating herds would return. This knowledge was more valuable than any spear or blade. For the first time, humans could prepare for nature instead of merely reacting to it. Their homes also changed. Mud brick houses were strengthened, with sturdy wooden fences to protect the early domesticated animals. They had begun to raise wild goats and sheep that slowly adapted to life beside humans. These animals provided a stable supply of food, even during the harshest seasons when hunting failed. As settlement life became more stable, new crafts began to flourish. Women shaped clay into beautiful pottery and hardened it in fire. Some vessels were simple, but others carried elegant shapes decorated with patterns inspired by rivers, animals, and dreams. These objects were more. As settlement life became more stable, new crafts began to flourish. Women shaped clay into beautiful pottery and hardened it in fire. Some vessels were simple, but others carried elegant shapes decorated with patterns inspired by rivers, animals, and dreams. These objects were more than tools. They were the first signs of human creativity blossoming within daily life. In the evenings, when the red glow of sunset filled the valley, the tribe gathered in a stone square at the center of their settlement. Here they performed new spiritual rituals, not just prayers for survival, but acts of gratitude toward the ancestors who had walked before them. Using pigments made from crushed roots and plants, they began to tattoo their skin with symbolic markings representing courage, family lineage, and personal achievements. Each mark told a story, a legendary hunt, a dangerous journey, or a brutal winter that had been survived. Gradually, a simple social structure began to form. The wisest members of the tribe were chosen to guard traditions and settle disputes between families. Their role was to ensure fairness in the sharing of food and resources. Without realizing it, they were laying the earliest foundations of organized communities, primitive societies where the voice of the group began to shape the destiny of everyone. As Bohr's generation grew older, a new generation rose, children born not into endless migration, but into a settled world. Their way of thinking was different. To them, humans were no longer helpless creatures beneath the power of nature. Instead, they saw themselves as partners with the land. They built simple irrigation channels that carried river water into fields. They experimented with wild plants, selecting seeds that produced larger and sweeter fruits. Exploration of distant lands still continued, but now travelers carried knowledge with them, mental maps of mountains and rivers along with bags of dried food prepared for journeys that could last many seasons. Contacts between distant tribes became more frequent. Old migration trails slowly turned into prehistoric trade routes where not only goods were exchanged, but also ideas, beliefs about gods, new artistic styles, and early philosophical thoughts about life and existence. On the brightest nights when bone flutes echoed through the valley and the rhythmic tapping of stones created a deep and ancient music, Bohr would look up at the star-filled sky with a sense of quiet peace. He understood that the task of his generation was complete. They had prepared the path for a new kind of humanity, a people capable of dreaming and capable of turning those dreams into reality through their hands and their minds. The brutal journey of survival, from the days of naked bodies trembling in freezing winters, had forged a spirit stronger than iron, a resilience that no storm or disaster could destroy. And so their story never truly ended. It simply changed form. What once lived as drawings on dark cave walls would eventually become the magnificent chronicles of human history. Their story reminds us that every step forward we take today stands upon countless silent struggles fought by our ancestors in the distant dawn of humanity. Life continues to grow, vivid, powerful, and endless, just like the fire those ancient people protected through thousands of years of storms. A fire that still lights the path toward distant futures, where humanity may one day reach beyond the earth itself and touch the stars shining high above. During deeper expeditions into the heart of the ancient mountains, where eternal mist filled deep cracks in the earth, Bohr's tribe encountered a strange substance unlike anything they had seen before. It glowed with a golden brilliance, like sunlight trapped inside stone. Along the dry riverbeds left behind after seasonal floods, They discovered heavy, soft pieces of metal that shimmered brightly and never lost their shine, even when buried in mud or soaked in icy water. This metal was gold. At first, the tribe did not use it to craft weapons. Gold was too soft for spears or axes, yet very quickly it became something far more powerful, a sacred symbol of the sun's strength upon the earth. Boer and the tribe's craftsmen began hammering the metal with hard stones, flattening it into thin golden sheets. From these, they created round ornaments worn on the chests of leaders and knowledge keepers. The arrival of gold transformed the tribe's understanding of value and authority. If copper had symbolized practicality and warfare, gold became the language of spirituality and eternity. They believed those who carried this unchanging light upon their bodies could communicate with the gods and guide the tribe safely through the darkness of death. The graves of honored members of the tribe began to be decorated with tiny golden beads, as if promising that their spirits would shine forever like the rising sun, even while resting deep within the cold earth. By now, survival was no longer just a battle against hunger or freezing winters. It had become a struggle to protect the growing complexity of culture and belief. The surplus of food from early agriculture allowed some members of the tribe to abandon hunting entirely. These individuals devoted their lives to studying the sky, gathering medicinal plants, and crafting works of art. They built massive stone observatories where carefully placed golden stones reflected sunlight on specific days of the year, during the winter solstice and the summer solstice, allowing the tribe to measure time with astonishing accuracy. The markets had also evolved. They were no longer simple exchanges of salt and animal hides. Now traders displayed intricate jewelry, beautifully carved staffs topped with golden wolf or eagle heads, symbols of power and wisdom. A civilization had begun to emerge, slowly rising from the raw wilderness of the ancient world. Yet prosperity brought new dangers. Distant tribes, still struggling in cold caves and harsh lands, began to look with envy toward Boer's fertile valley. The tribe soon realized that survival now required more than tools and knowledge. It required protection. They organized their first true armies and built strong fortresses of stone and wood on high defensive ground. Warriors no longer fought as lone hunters driven by instinct. They moved together in coordinated groups, wearing leather armor reinforced with copper plates. Their commanders carried golden sun symbols upon their chests as marks of leadership. These conflicts forced the tribe to develop new strategies: defensive walls, signal horns carved from the massive horns of wild bulls, and even the use of fire as a weapon against approaching enemies. As Boer grew older, he often sat upon the highest stone platform of the fortress, gazing down at rows of grass-roofed houses. The sound of metal hammers striking copper echoed through the settlement, mixing with the laughter of children reciting stories about the tribe's past. Sometimes he could hardly believe the world he was seeing. He remembered the early days, when people shivered in dark caves with no clothing, terrified of the night. Now humans had learned to create their own light, to tame wild beasts and to shape the earth around them. Survival had become an art of living, where every person played a role within a powerful and enduring community. Yet their journey was far from finished. Humanity continued to push outward, across oceans they once feared, toward frozen lands and burning deserts. Everywhere they traveled, new villages appeared. New cave paintings were drawn. New stories of courage were told beside the fire. It was an endless current of intelligence and determination, a heroic saga written in sweat, blood, and an unbreakable belief in the future. And even after tens of thousands of years pass, after the stone fortresses crumble into dust, the spirit of those prehistoric people will never disappear. They were the ones who first stood upright against the storms of the Ice Age, and their courage remains a torch that continues to guide every generation of humanity as we climb toward ever greater horizons. As the darkness of the early Bronze Age slowly gave way to more organized and structured societies, Boer, now more a legend than a man of flesh and bone, often stood gazing toward the horizon, where the purple silhouettes of mountains met the eternal canopy of stars. The survival of humanity had transformed. No longer was it simply about searching for life, but about defining what life truly meant. People began to build the first libraries, not from paper and ink, but from towering pillars of stone carved with symbols. These markings recorded the rhythm of harvest seasons, the movements of guiding stars, and the laws that governed peaceful coexistence between tribes. Humanity had realized something profound. If they wished to endure for thousands of years, they could not only pass down food or weapons, they had to preserve memory. From the simple marketplaces where material goods were once traded, centers of knowledge gradually emerged. Craftsmen no longer focused solely on shaping gold and copper. They began experimenting with finer clay, firing it into tablets on which they etched records, counting the stores of grain in communal granaries or preserving songs that told of the creation of the world. Survival had now merged with the human desire to be remembered. People feared death less than before because they knew their names and achievements would be carved into stone, retold through melodies played on bone flutes that had become more intricate and expressive than ever before. Community bonds grew stronger than any weapon. If someone fell ill at the far end of the village, the entire tribe would venture into the forest searching for rare healing herbs, not out of obligation, but because they understood that every person was an irreplaceable piece of the great mosaic of civilization. Yet once again, nature tested humanity's resolve. Severe droughts began to strike the land, and rivers that once flowed freely slowly shrank and disappeared. But unlike tens of thousands of years earlier, when people could only flee, Boer's descendants now possessed knowledge. They fought back with ingenuity. Together they dug long canals stretching for miles, channeling water from mountain lakes into their settlements. They built vast reservoirs from limestone and hardened tree resin to store precious water for dry seasons. Survival had become a battle of engineering, patience, and collective effort. No longer did they bow to fate. They reshaped the land itself, turning barren deserts into green fields and transforming dry caves into vibrant villages filled with firelight and laughter. And when the final sunset of a heroic age began to fade, Boer lay surrounded by the arms of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. These children no longer knew the bone-chilling cold of winters without clothing. They had never experienced the primal terror of endless darkness. They looked at Boer not with pity, but with reverence, almost as one would look upon a divine ancestor who had lit the first path forward. Boer's true legacy was not the gold that once shone upon a leader's chest. His legacy was the fire of knowledge now burning brightly in the eyes of the young. The story of the prehistoric man who once endured the freezing winter had become something greater, a lesson in courage, a reminder that every triumph begins with trembling steps that refuse to retreat, even in the middle of a raging snowstorm. And the journey did not end there. It continued through ages of iron and steel, through the age of steam, and later into the era of intelligent machines. Yet no matter how far humanity travels, no matter if we one day reach distant galaxies, we will still carry something ancient within us. Deep in our hearts, we remain the children of Boer's tribe. We still carry the warmth of that Ice Age fire and the endless human desire to connect with one another. From the earliest days of survival, humanity learned a timeless truth. Nature may be harsh, the universe may be vast, but with hearts capable of compassion and minds capable of endless creation, humanity will always remain one of the greatest explorers of existence, continuing to write its brilliant story until the final stars in the sky fade into darkness. As the wheel of time continued rolling through the dust of the Bronze Age, humanity entered a new era. The scattered tribes that once descended from Boer had gradually gathered, forming kingdoms and empires, societies that would one day be known as the Middle Ages, magnificent yet often harsh. Our story now follows a distant descendant of Boer, a young man named Elric, who lived in a small village beneath the looming gray stone castle of a powerful lord. Survival in this age was no longer a battle against cave bears or saber-toothed tigers. Instead, it was a struggle against strict social rules, heavy taxes, and the bitter cold that seeped through the moss-covered stone walls of medieval life. Though people now had clothing, the winter cold of the Middle Ages remained a cunning enemy. Elric wore a rough wool cloak dyed the color of earth and mud, a fabric far from the fine silks worn by nobles in their castles. Inside the fragile wooden huts with straw roofs, fire was still the heart of life, though now it burned within smoky stone fireplaces. Survival meant gathering stacks of dry firewood during autumn and storing grain in underground cellars to protect it from rats and mold. Each morning, when frost still covered the barley fields in white, Elric stepped outside wearing worn leather shoes stuffed with straw for warmth. In his hands he carried an iron plow, turning the hard soil of the land, soil from which much of the harvest would eventually be delivered to the Lord's castle as tax. In the medieval world, Survival was deeply woven together with faith and the hope of salvation. The ringing bells of the village church echoed across the valley, marking not only the passing of hours, but also offering spiritual rhythm to help people endure years of famine and waves of dark disease. When the Black Death spread across continents, knocking on the doors of countless homes, Boer's distant descendants once again faced a terrifying challenge. But this time, they began to fight with knowledge. They learned the importance of isolation and developed early forms of herbal medicine that were more organized than before. No longer did everyone believe such illness was simply the work of evil spirits. People slowly began to understand the idea of contagion, even creating strange bird. Medieval markets had also evolved far beyond the simple gatherings of ancient times. They had become lively towns filled with guilds of skilled craftsmen. Elric would carry bundles of sheep's wool and jars of wild honey to the city, traveling across uneven stone roads. There he traded them for finely forged iron tools or rare spices brought from distant eastern lands. Trade was no longer a simple exchange between strangers. It had become a structured system involving contracts and gold coins stamped with the image of the ruling king. Survival had grown into a complex economic web, where political changes in distant capitals could determine whether a peasant family's dinner table was full or painfully empty. Yet in roadside inns, beside mugs of strong barley ale, the ancient stories of Boer and the primal world were still told. Those tales reminded listeners that despite the changing shape of society, the human instinct to rise above hardship had never changed. At night, by the faint glow of candlelight, Elric would look at the woven tapestries hanging along the walls. They depicted knights, heroic journeys, and legendary battles. Watching them, he realized something important. Even in a world of mighty castles and steel swords, survival still demanded courage and intelligence just as it had in the age of his ancestors. Humans had learned to build complex irrigation systems, to harness the wind through massive windmills, and to transform the forces of nature into tools for civilization. Life in the Middle Ages became a harmony between the patient labor of farmers working endless fields and the burning curiosity of scholars studying quietly within monastery libraries. And so the story of humanity continued, from caves to castles, from stone arrows to shining steel swords, preparing the world for an even greater leap forward into an age of exploration, discovery, and the bright light of knowledge yet to come. When the pure white sails of the age of exploration proudly stretched across the open seas, a descendant of Elric, a young sailor named Julian, continued the heroic story of survival for his bloodline. This time, the stage was no longer caves, valleys, or castles, but the unstable decks of oak ships rolling endlessly upon the vast oceans. Survival in this age was no longer confined by castle walls or narrow barley fields. Instead, it expanded toward unknown horizons, where the line between immense wealth and sudden death was often no thicker than a fragile wooden plank beneath a sailor's feet. At sea, survival became a battle against malnutrition and crushing loneliness. Julian learned to endure months drifting across the ocean with rations consisting mainly of rock-hard biscuits, crawling with worms, and barrels of fresh water that slowly turned green with algae. A terrifying illness known as scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, became the new snow demon of this era, causing bleeding gums, weakness, and slow death among the crew. To survive, sailors discovered new methods, preserving cabbage as sauerkraut, storing precious lemons and citrus fruits, and collecting every drop of rainwater that fell onto the giant sails of their ships. Each tropical storm that rose from the horizon, bringing waves as tall as mountains, forced Julian to confront the same ancient fear that Boer once felt before the brutal forces of nature. But unlike Boer, the sailors now possessed tools, magnetic compasses, and increasingly accurate nautical maps that helped guide them through the endless blue wilderness. When Julian and his crew finally stepped onto distant new lands, survival took on another dimension, cultural and biological adaptation. They encountered unfamiliar diseases, strange animals never described in medieval texts, and the cautious suspicion of indigenous tribes. Yet the ancient instinct for trade, born long ago in Boer's primitive riverside markets, returned once again. The explorers exchanged glass mirrors and iron axes for exotic goods, black pepper, cinnamon, and unfamiliar crops such as corn and potatoes. These crops would later transform Europe's food supply and save millions from devastating famine. Julian's life became a balance between the bravery of a warrior and the sharp instincts of a merchant. Every step across a foreign beach was another chapter written in humanity's grand journal of discovery. This era also witnessed the rise of experimental science. Instead of relying only on prayer, sailors like Julian began using early telescopes to observe the stars. They calculated latitude and longitude to determine their position on the open ocean. Survival had turned into a problem of mathematics and logic. No longer did sailors fear mythical sea monsters lurking in the deep. They began to understand ocean currents, wind patterns, and even the round shape of the Earth itself. The survival of an entire ship now depended on strict discipline and the maintenance of complex instruments such as marine chronometers and bronze cannons, distant technological descendants of the very copper that Bohr once traded for thousands of years earlier. On bright moonlit nights in the Pacific Ocean, while waves whispered against the ship's hull, Julian would gaze up at the glowing band of the Milky Way stretching across the sky. In those moments, he felt an invisible connection to his distant ancestors. From damp caves to the unstable decks of ships, humanity had always been a restless traveler. The dream of finding a promised land had always pushed humans forward, driving them beyond fear and hardship. Every new territory they discovered, every trade route they established, became another stone laid in the foundation of a more connected world, where civilizations collided, blended, and flourished together. Whether in prehistoric times, the medieval world, or the age of great ocean voyages, human survival has always been a relentless effort to push beyond limits. Julian smiled as he thought about the children waiting back in his homeland. One day they would taste sweet fruits from the lands he had discovered. They would listen to stories about the vast ocean, just as Bohr once told stories about the frozen winters of the Ice Age. The flame of life and exploration continues, to pass from one generation to the next, burning brighter with every century. And as long as even a single pair of human eyes continues to look toward the distant horizon, humanity will never stop moving forward, no matter how vast the ocean that lies ahead. As Julian's great sails slowly gave way to towering smokestacks rising into the sky, the descendants of Bohr's lineage entered one of the most dramatic chapters in human history, the Industrial Revolution. At this time, a young man named Thomas, living in the narrow streets of cities like London or Manchester, no longer had to battle cave bears or ocean storms. Instead, he faced a new monster, one created by humanity itself: machines and urbanization. Survival had now shifted from green open fields into massive red brick factories, where the roaring of steam engines replaced the howling wind of ancient forests. Thomas had to adapt to a completely new concept of time. Life was no longer guided by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the shrill whistle of the factory and the relentless rhythm of spinning gears. To survive meant working 14 hours a day inside thick clouds of coal smoke, where human lungs had to endure dry, dust-filled air. The bone needles of prehistoric days had evolved into thousands of steel, weaving shuttles clattering endlessly across textile machines. These factories produced cloth for the entire world, but they also placed humanity under new tests of endurance and perseverance. Inside the crowded houses of the city's slums, survival blended with a constant struggle against poverty and disease. Illnesses such as cholera and tuberculosis spread easily through the dense neighborhoods. Thomas and his family had to learn to live within cramped spaces, where clean water was more precious than the wild honey of prehistoric times. Yet within the dark, smoke-filled streets, the ancient spirit of the old tribe rose again in a new form: labor unions and worker solidarity. Workers shared their last pieces of bread during strikes. They gathered under dim oil lamps at night to read books and educate themselves. Slowly, they realized that intelligence and unity were still the only weapons capable of resisting the cold, grinding gears of industrial power. Meanwhile, science and engineering advanced to the point where humanity could seemingly tame iron and fire. Massive steel locomotives roared across the countryside. Thomas often stood beside the tracks, watching steam trains thunder across fields in clouds of white smoke. In that moment, he understood that space and time themselves were shrinking. Survival no longer meant walking for weeks to reach a market. Instead, it required sharp awareness to seize opportunities in a rapidly expanding global economy. The green copper that Bohr once traded had now transformed into telegraph wires stretching across continents, sending information around the world almost instantly. Human survival was no longer based solely on physical strength. It depended on the ability to operate complex machines and think logically in a society that changed with astonishing speed. Yet even surrounded by iron and steam, deep within Thomas's heart lived the values passed down from his ancestors. After long, exhausting workdays, he would sit beside the coal fireplace and tell his children ancient stories, stories of people who once hunted mammoths and crossed vast oceans. He reminded them that no matter how modern the world became, the values of love, resilience, and determination would never change. Every screw he tightened and every thread he wove was a small step in humanity's journey forward, preparing the world for an even greater leap into the age of electricity, atomic power, and eventually artificial intelligence. The survival of humanity across the ages stands as proof of extraordinary adaptability. One evening, Thomas looked out his window and saw the first electric lights illuminating the streets. In that quiet moment, he understood that darkness had retreated once more. The flame that Bohr once ignited in a cold stone cave had now transformed into millions of lights shining across cities, guiding humanity toward a future where people would not merely survive, but continuously create new wonders. And so, the long journey of humanity, from the freezing caves of the Ice Age to the cities glowing with electric light, comes to a close tonight. From Bohr to Elric, Julian to Thomas. Each generation has carried forward the flame of survival that their ancestors ignited tens of thousands of years ago. If you listen closely, perhaps in the sound of the night wind outside your window, there still echo the stories of a very distant past, the footsteps of prehistoric people trekking through snowy forests, the waves crashing against wooden ships crossing the ocean, or the slow turning of mechanical gears in the world's first factories. But now, as the night grows still, it is time for us to pause that journey. Relax your body, close your eyes, and let your mind drift slowly like a boat on still waters. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, the story of humanity will continue, just as it has always continued for thousands of years. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. I wish you a deep, peaceful sleep, and I will see you again in the next story. Good night.